It was a Tuesday morning in March of 1978 when Earl Jenkins walked into Patterson's John Deere dealership in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The spring sun was warming the blacktop parking lot. Earl needed a new drawbar pin for his 1965 Farmall 806. The red tractor had been working his 320 acres since he bought it used in 1972, and it never let him down. The dealership was impressive. Patterson's had expanded twice in 5 years. The showroom floor gleamed with new equipment. A 4640 sat center stage, green paint perfect under fluorescent lights, price tag reading $42,000. Through the big windows, rows of tractors lined the lot, everything from small utilities to big four-wheel drives. The parts counter was empty when Earl walked in, so he waited. Eventually, Derek Patterson stepped out from the back office. He was the owner's son, fresh out of college with a business degree and ideas about modern farming. He wore pressed slacks and a John Deere polo shirt. "Help you?" Derek asked, barely looking up from his clipboard. "Need a drawbar pin for an 806, Earl said. Derek's eyes flicked up. 806? International Harvester? He said it like the words tasted bad. "That's right, 1965 model." Derek set down his clipboard and leaned against the counter. "You know, we could get you into a brand new 4440 for a reasonable monthly payment. That old red tractor's 13 years old now. Technology's moved on. You're burning more fuel, losing productivity, and when something breaks, parts are getting harder to find." Earl shifted his weight. "Tractor runs fine, just need a pin." "I'm sure it runs," Derek said, that slight smile appearing. "But you're farming with yesterday's equipment. My dad's got a customer traded in a 4020 last week, low hours. We could make you a real good deal. 8,000 gets you in, or finance new." "Not interested in payments," Earl said. Derek shook his head. "You know how many farmers I see hanging onto old iron thinking they're saving money? Then one day that tractor throws a rod and suddenly they're scrambling. Can't get parts fast enough. Crops in the field. They end up paying more in the long run. Drawbar pin's about $8, Earl said quietly. "It's not about one pin," Derek said. "It's about the mindset. You can't compete in modern agriculture with 1960s equipment. The guys making real money, they're running new iron. 150 horsepower, cabs, air conditioning. They're comfortable, efficient." Earl didn't say anything. Derek opened a parts catalog, flipping through it slowly. "I'll order your pin. Should be here end of the week. But you think about what I said. That 806 is a dinosaur, probably worth 3,000 trade-in if I'm being generous. You're sitting on a depreciating asset." The pin arrived 4 days later. Earl picked it up, paid his $8.65, and left. He didn't stop at Patterson's dealership again. What Derek Patterson didn't know about Earl Jenkins could fill a book. Earl had started farming in 1969 with 80 acres inherited from his Uncle Vernon and a 1947 John Deere Model A. He worked construction 4 days a week at $3.75 an hour and farmed on weekends. Every dollar that wasn't feeding his family went into the land bank account. His wife Martha kept the books with a simple system. Living expenses came from construction. Farm income went to savings. By 1972, Earl had saved $18,000. When old Chester Morris retired at 72, his 240 acres came up for sale at $75 an acre. Total, $18,000. Chester had one condition. "Take my tractor too, 1965 Farmall 806. Bought it new. Can't stand seeing it rust, $1,500. The 806 was worth twice that. Earl knew it. Chester knew Earl knew it. They shook hands. Earl paid $19,500 cash for 240 acres and a tractor that would change his life. The 806 was built like a tank. 6-cylinder diesel, 95 horsepower, live PTO. Chester had maintained it obsessively. It ran like a Swiss watch. Earl's philosophy was simple. Buy land, not payments. Equipment was a tool, not a status symbol. If it started every morning and did the work, it was good enough. He did his own maintenance, taught himself welding, could rebuild a carburetor on the kitchen table. His shop was a pole barn he'd built himself, heated by a wood stove bought at auction for $60. Martha kept asking the same question every year. Do we owe anybody anything? If the answer was no, it was a good year. In 1973, Earl quit construction. The 320 acres was supporting them. Martha kept her bookkeeping job 3 days a week for health insurance. They lived below their means, saved every extra dollar. Earl's neighbors thought he was crazy. They were expanding, buying new equipment, leveraging equity. The agriculture press talked about get big or get out. Earl didn't see how $100,000 in debt made you more efficient. In 1978, corn was bringing $2.20 a bushel. Earl's 806 pulled a 4-row planter he bought used in 1974. His neighbor, Jim Hartley, ran a new 4430 pulling a 12-row planter. Jim planted his 640 acres in 3 days. It took Earl nearly 2 weeks to plant his 3 on 20. "You're leaving money on the table," Jim told him one evening. They were standing at the fence line between their properties. "Time is money, Earl. 2 weeks to plant. I'm already done and working on other things." "What other things?" Earl asked. Jim paused. "Well, maintenance, paperwork, stuff. I do that at night," Earl said. "Don't cost me nothing to take 2 weeks if the tractor's paid for." "You could double your operation," Jim pressed. "Banks giving 7% on farm loans." "Land's appreciating faster than that. You're missing opportunities." Earl looked out over his fields. "Maybe, but I sleep good at night." By 1980, Patterson's John Deere dealership was thriving. Derek had convinced his father to expand, adding a second building for used equipment and a maintenance shop that could handle 8 tractors at once. They hired 4 new mechanics. Derek himself drove a new Cadillac Eldorado and bought a lake house near Okoboji. The bank loved farmers like Jim Hartley. Jim had expanded to 200 acres by 1981, running 2 4640s and a 4440. His combine was a 7720 with a 6-row corn head. He'd built a new machine shed 80 feet by 120 feet, climate-controlled. His total operating loan was touching $400,000, but land was appreciating and yields were up. The bank's agricultural loan officer told him he had nothing to worry about. Earl still farmed his 320 acres with the 806. He'd added a 1962 Farmall 560 he bought at an estate auction for $200. The old farmer's widow didn't want it sitting there. Earl rebuilt the hydraulic pump, changed all the fluids, and had a second tractor. Total investment, $1,600. Then 1981 hit, and the world changed overnight. Interest rates went to 20%. The Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, was fighting double-digit inflation by making money expensive. Farm loans that had been 7 or 8% suddenly adjusted upward. Equipment loans, land loans, operating loans, all of them climbed. The variable rate loans that farmers had been told were smart financing became nooses around their necks. At the same time, grain prices started falling. Export markets dried up. The Soviet grain embargo, imposed by President Carter in 1980 after the invasion of Afghanistan, had damaged American agriculture's reputation as a reliable supplier. Foreign buyers went elsewhere. Domestic demand couldn't absorb the surplus. Corn that had been $3 a bushel in 1980 dropped to $2.40 by 1982. By 1985, it would hit $2 even. The mathematics were brutal. If you owed $200,000 at 20% interest, you owed $40,000 a year in interest alone before touching the principal. To pay that, you needed to clear 20,000 bushels of corn at current prices. On average Iowa land, that was 130 acres of perfect yield corn. And that was just interest. You still had to eat, pay property taxes, buy fuel, maintain equipment, live your life. Farmers who'd expanded on credit found themselves in an impossible situation. They couldn't make their payments. They couldn't refinance because land values were dropping. They couldn't sell because nobody was buying. They were trapped. Jim Hartley came to Earl's place in January of 1983. It was a Sunday evening, cold, snow on the ground. Martha answered the door. Jim stood there in his Carhartt jacket, no smile, face looking like he'd aged 10 years since Earl had seen him at the co-op a month earlier. "Jim," Martha said, "come in. Coffee?" "That'd be good." They sat in Earl's kitchen. The house was warm. On the stove, a pot of beef stew simmered for dinner. The kitchen table was old oak, solid, worn smooth by years of use. Jim wrapped his hands around the coffee mug Martha had poured him, staring into it like it might have answers. "Bank's calling my notes," Jim said finally. "All of them. Want me to pay down the principal by April or they'll foreclose." "How much?" Earl asked. $140,000. Earl let out a low whistle. Jim's operation was bigger than his, more sophisticated, more modern. Jim ran 200 acres now, had 2 new tractors, a combine, a grain bin operation that could hold 50,000 bushels. On paper, it was impressive. In reality, it was all mortgaged. "I can't raise it," Jim said. "I've got maybe 20,000 in cash. Grain prices are in the toilet, land's dropped 30%. I'm underwater on everything. What's the bank say? Sell, liquidate. They've got 40-50 farmers in the same situation. Said it's not personal, it's just business. They've got shareholders to answer to, regulations, federal examiners breathing down their necks. I'm just a number on a spreadsheet now." Martha refilled his coffee. She didn't say anything, but her face showed sympathy. "I'm going to lose it," Jim said quietly. "All of it. The land, the equipment, probably the house. Donna's crying every night. Kids don't understand. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that daddy's losing the farm because the bank decided 20% interest was acceptable?" "I'm sorry, Jim," Earl said. Jim looked up. His eyes were red. "You were right, Earl. I thought you were behind the times, stuck in the past. I remember telling you 2 years ago you were leaving money on the table, remember? Said you could double your operation. I was so sure I had it figured out." "We all did what made sense at the time," Earl said. "No," Jim said. "You did what made sense. I did what felt good. Big tractors, new equipment, everybody seeing me as successful. I wanted to be one of the big operators, you know. Wanted people to drive by and see that I'd made it. Turns out I made it right into bankruptcy." He drained his coffee. "My auction's set for May 10th. Everything goes. Tractors, combine, planter, trucks, tools. The land selling separately to Ag Ventures out of Des Moines. Some corporate farm that doesn't care about anything except yield per acre and return on investment." "Where will you go?" Martha asked. "Cedar Rapids. My brother-in-law's got a line on a job for me at the Quaker Oats plant, production line work. Donna can probably get something at a grocery store. We'll make it." "Just won't be farming." Jim stood up. "I just wanted to tell you, you've been a good neighbor, Earl, better than I deserved." He extended his hand. Earl shook it. "You need anything between now and then, you let me know." "I will." But Earl never heard from Jim again. Jim Hartley's auction was on a Saturday in May. Earl didn't go. He couldn't stomach it. Martha went and reported back. Said the whole county turned out, not to support Jim, but to scavenge. His 4640 sold for $18,000, half what he owed on it. The combine went for $25,000 against a $65,000 loan balance. The banks took the losses and wrote them off. Jim took the shame and left town. All over Iowa, the same story played out. All over the Midwest. Auctions every weekend, foreclosure sales, estate liquidations when farmers couldn't take the pressure anymore and chose final solutions. The newspapers called it the farm crisis. Rural sociologists called it the hollowing out of agricultural America. In the small towns and rural communities, they just called it the end. The statistics were brutal. Between 1980 and 1985, Iowa lost 15,000 farms. Kansas lost 11,000. Nebraska lost 8,000. These weren't marginal operations. These were third-generation farms, families that had worked the same land for 70 years, gone in one bad loan decision. The suicide rate among farmers doubled. Rural banks failed. Small towns that depended on farm income saw their main streets empty out. Implement dealers closed. Feed stores went under. Patterson's John Deere dealership started feeling it in late 1982. Farmers stopped buying. Derek Patterson had $1.2 million in inventory gathering dust. By 1984, they'd laid off mechanics. Derek's father had a stroke in 1986. Derek tried to hold it together, but revenue was down 70%. In 1987, Patterson's closed. Inventory shipped back to Deere. Derek moved to Omaha, got into insurance sales. Earl Jenkins kept farming. His 806 turned 22 in 1987. He'd replaced the clutch once, rebuilt the injector pump, put new tires on it. Total maintenance over 15 years, maybe $4,000. It started every morning, pulled the same implements. When grain prices were low, Earl cut back. He didn't buy unless something broke beyond repair. He and Martha lived in the same house, drove old vehicles, took cheap vacations. They banked the difference. By 1990, Earl had $65,000 saved. When Dan Morrison passed, Earl bought his 160 acres for cash. Now he farmed 480 acres. In June 1990, Earl found a 1969 John Deere 4020 at an estate auction. One owner, 4,100 hours, maintained religiously. The owner had lost his farm in the crisis. Earl got it for $5,200. It had been $12,000 new. In 1993, 15 years after Derek Patterson had laughed at his old Farmall in that showroom, Earl drove past the empty Patterson's dealership building on his way to the co-op. The auto parts chain that had bought it in 1988 had moved out the year before, relocated to a strip mall closer to the highway. The building sat vacant now, windows dusty, weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot where Derek's gleaming new inventory used to sit. Earl looked at it every time he drove past. Big building, good bones, 8 service bays, offices, parts storage. It was just sitting there, empty, wasting. But he didn't need it. He had his shop at home, had his equipment scattered between a few different sheds on his property. It worked fine. Still, something about that building bothered him. Not the building itself, but what it represented. All that confidence, all that certainty Derek had shown, that absolute conviction that new was better and debt was just smart business, had ended up as an empty building with weeds in the parking lot. Earl didn't feel good about it. He'd never wished Derek ill. The young salesman had been arrogant and condescending, sure, but he'd also just been young and confident and certain he knew how the world worked. A lot of people had thought that way in the late 70s and early 80s. Most of them had learned differently. Some had learned it the hard way. Earl wondered sometimes where Derek was now, if he ever thought about those days in the dealership, if he ever drove past that building and felt anything. Probably not. Probably put it all behind him and moved on. People usually did. Earl's approach to farming wasn't fancy. It wasn't impressive. When people in town asked him about it, when younger farmers who'd started after the crisis wanted to know how he'd survived when so many hadn't, he told them the truth. Own what you run, fix what you break, save what you can. Don't owe the bank. Don't chase trends. Don't try to impress anybody. Just do the work and do it sustainably. Some of them got it. Some didn't. The ones who got it usually made it. The ones who didn't usually ended up working for the ones who did. His 806 turned 30 years old in 1995. By then it had over 12,000 hours on it. Earl had rebuilt the engine in 1991, did most of the work himself in his shop over the winter. New pistons, new rings, new bearings, new valves, new injectors. He pulled the head himself, took the block to a machine shop in Cedar Rapids to have it bored and the crank turned. Cost him about $1,800 in parts and machining work, and 3 months of evening work putting it all back together. When he finished, he fired it up on a February morning, cold, temperature in the teens. The diesel turned over slow at first, battery straining, then caught and rumbled to life. Earl let it warm up, watching the gauges, listening to the engine. Smooth, quiet, no smoke. He'd done it right. The tractor came out of that rebuild running like new, maybe better. It had new life in it, another 10,000 hours if Earl maintained it right. And he would. That was the thing about old equipment. If you took care of it, it took care of you. People in town knew Earl as the guy with the old tractors, the guy who still farmed with equipment from the 60s and 70s, while other farmers ran modern iron with GPS and computerized planting systems. Younger farmers, the ones who'd started after the crisis, sometimes asked him about it. How'd you make it through? How'd you survive when everyone else went under? What's the secret? I didn't do anything special, Earl would say. Just didn't borrow what I couldn't pay back. But that wasn't quite true, and Earl knew it. What Earl did was special precisely because it required something most people don't have: discipline. Real discipline. The discipline to watch your neighbor plant his 640 acres in 3 days, while you take 2 weeks to plant your 320 and not feel like you're losing. The discipline to drive a tractor older than your kids and not care what the salesman at the dealership says or thinks. The discipline to have money in the bank and not spend it just because you can, just because the newest model tractor looks good sitting in the showroom. That kind of discipline was rare. That kind of discipline was what separated the farmers who made it from the farmers who went under. In 2000, Earl was 62 years old. He'd been farming for 31 years. He owned 480 acres free and clear, land that was now worth $2,500 an acre and climbing. He had 3 tractors, all paid for, all running. His equipment was old but functional. He'd put 2 kids through college without taking out a single student loan. He and Martha had $180,000 saved for retirement. The farm was going to his son, Michael, who'd been working it with him for 5 years and knew every acre, every piece of equipment, every maintenance schedule by heart. Michael was different from Earl, but the same where it counted. He had new ideas, wanted to try no-till farming, wanted to experiment with cover crops and precision agriculture. But he understood the fundamentals. Don't owe more than you can pay. Don't buy what you can't afford. Treat equipment with respect and it'll last. Build equity, not debt. That same year, Earl drove past the old Patterson dealership location and noticed something different. There was a for sale sign out front. Fresh sign, professional, from a commercial real estate company. Earl noticed it but didn't think much about it. Vacant commercial buildings weren't his concern. But Michael did think about it. "Dad," Michael said that evening. They were in Earl's shop, doing maintenance on the 4020, changing filters, checking fluids, getting ready for spring planting. "That Patterson building, that's for sale. What do you think it would cost?" Earl looked up from the oil filter he was threading on. "Don't know. Why?" "We need more shop space," Michael said. "We're running more acres than we used to. We've got equipment scattered in 3 different sheds, 2 different locations. Combines in the Morton shed. Planters are in the old barn. Tractors are here. It's inefficient. One good building would make sense. Let us consolidate everything. Have room to work on multiple pieces at once. Keep it all organized." Earl thought about it. "We don't need it. We could use it," Michael pressed. "And it's not just about need. It's about efficiency. How much time do we waste moving equipment between storage locations? How much would we save having everything in one place with proper workspace?" Earl couldn't argue with that. He'd thought the same thing himself more than once, especially in spring when they were trying to get everything ready at the same time and parts were in one building, tools in another, equipment in a third. "I'll call," Earl said. The real estate agent's name was Sharon Miller. She'd listed the building at $185,000. Earl asked about the history. She told him the bank had taken it back in 1995 when the auto parts chain defaulted on their lease. It had sat empty since then. The bank wanted it off their books. "Can I see it?" Earl asked. "Absolutely. When works for you?" They met the next afternoon. Sharon unlocked the front door and Earl walked into the building for the first time in over 20 years. It was empty now, but the bones were good. 8 service bays, ceiling tall enough for big equipment. Offices in the front, parts storage in the back. Concrete floors, good drainage, industrial electrical. It needed cleaning, needed some repairs, but nothing major. Earl walked through slowly, Michael beside him. The building had good memories mixed with bad ones. This was where Derek had laughed at the 806, where he'd called Earl's approach to farming outdated and inefficient. This was also where dozens of farmers had bought equipment they couldn't afford, chasing a dream of expansion and efficiency that ended in foreclosure and shame. "What do you think?" Michael asked. "It's a good building," Earl said. "Can we afford it?" Earl had been thinking about that. At $185,000, they could pay cash and still have a comfortable cushion in savings. They could also finance part of it, keep more cash liquid. The question wasn't affordability. The question was whether it made sense. "Make them an offer," Earl said. $120,000 cash. Close in 30 days. Sharon made a face. "That's low. Bank's asking $185,000. "Bank's had it empty for 5 years, Earl said. They're paying taxes on it, paying insurance, getting nothing. Tell them $120,000 cash, clean close, no contingencies, 30 days. See what they say. Sharon made the call from her car. Came back 10 minutes later. They'll take it. Earl wrote a check for $1,000 as earnest money. They closed 3 weeks later. Earl wrote another check for $119,000. Just like that, he owned the Patterson's dealership building. When Earl walked through the empty building as owner for the first time, he remembered standing at that parts counter in March of 1978. Derek Patterson telling him his 806 was a dinosaur, that he couldn't compete with 1960s equipment, that he was costing himself money. He remembered the smile, the condescension, the absolute certainty that debt and newness equaled success. Earl didn't buy the building out of spite. He bought it because it made sense for his operation. But there was something poetic about it anyway. The guy who'd laughed at old equipment now had his former dealership owned by the farmer who'd kept that old equipment running for 35 years. The farmer who'd been told he couldn't compete now owned the building where that advice had been given. Life had a funny way of working out sometimes. Earl's 1965 Farmall 806 is still running today. Michael farms with it on their operation, now expanded to 720 acres. The tractor's 58 years old. It's been rebuilt twice, maintained constantly, and treated with respect. It doesn't have a cab. It doesn't have air conditioning. It doesn't have a radio. But every spring it starts, and it works. The Patterson building is now Jenkins Farm Equipment Storage. They keep their tractors there, their planter, their combines, their tools. In the back bay, where Derek Patterson used to park his Cadillac, sits that 1965 Farmall 806. Red paint, faded but engine strong. There's no moral here that fits on a bumper sticker. Earl didn't win because old is always better. He won because he understood something fundamental. In farming, like in life, it's not what you make that matters. It's what you keep. Equipment depreciates, land appreciates, debt compounds, discipline pays. Derek Patterson sold new tractors and died broke. Earl Jenkins ran old tractors and retired comfortable. One of them understood farming as a business. The other understood it as a lifestyle that had to be sustainable across decades, not quarters. When young farmers come to Michael now, asking about getting started, he walks them back to that 1965 Farmall. He tells them the story. Not to say never buy new equipment, but to understand that the goal isn't to impress the neighbors. It's to still be farming when the neighbors are gone. That 806 has outlasted the dealership that mocked it, the salesman who ridiculed it, and the credit-fueled expansion that nearly destroyed rural America. It's still there, red and loud and reliable, a monument to the idea that sometimes the old way isn't the wrong way. It's just the way that lasts,